The other major story tonight, the new threat from North Korea. The escalating war of words, North Korea now threatening missile tests every week.
Tonight, a defiant North Korea pledging to conduct missile tests on a weekly, monthly, and yearly basis, accusing the White House of pushing the situation there to the brink of war.
When asked if he had any message for Pyongyang at an Easter event at the White House, this is what he had to say.
Hi, Mr. President. Hi, say hi. Say hi.
Gotta behave.
The remark follows Trump's continued warnings to North Korea on his Twitter account. Watchers have interpreted this as his strong determination not to tolerate the regime's nuclear and missile programs. On the same day, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said Trump will not be telegraphing possible actions against North Korea. Spicer said that unlike Syria, Trump will not draw a red line for North Korea.
But happening just moments ago now, North Korea's United Nations ambassador warning the United States that, quote, a thermal nuclear war may break out at any moment.
Some nuclear war may break out at any moment on the peninsula.
Pyongyang's deputy ambassador to the UN slammed Washington's naval build-up in the waters off the Korean peninsula, as well as the missile strikes in Syria.
The United States is disturbing the global peace and stability and insisting on the gangster-like logic that its invasion of the sovereign state is too decisive and just and proportionate, and contribute to defending the international order in its bid to apply it to the Korean peninsula as well.
The comments came just hours after the US vice president visited a demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea.
Now, in the meantime, Russia has warned Washington against launching a unilateral attack on North Korea.
We do not accept the reckless nuclear missile actions of Pyongyang that breach UN resolutions, but that does not mean that you can break international law. I hope that there will not be any unilateral actions like the one we saw recently in Syria.
The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also said that any attack on North Korea would be very dangerous. He made the comments after the U.S. Vice President Mike Pence said the era of strategic patience with Pyongyang is over.
Chinese and Russian intelligence-gathering vessels are reportedly tailing a U.S. aircraft carrier as it travels toward the Korean peninsula. According to an April 16th Associated Press report, Russian and Chinese forces have launched surveillance ships to track the movement of U.S. ships in the region. Japanese forces, in turn, have reportedly stepped up their monitoring operations in the airspace and waters around the East China Sea. In early April, the U.S. Navy ordered the Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group to the waters off the Korean peninsula amid rising tensions with North Korea. Both China and Russia expressed concern about the move, with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying the issue should be resolved peacefully through political and diplomatic efforts. The deployment of the intelligence-gathering vessels is reportedly aimed at sending a warning signal to the U.S. The U.S. Air Force has deployed its newest stealth fighters to the U.K. as part of an effort to reassure Europe in the face of Russian aggression. On April 14th, the Pentagon announced that the Air Force's F-35A had been deployed internationally for the first time. The jets from Hill Air Force Base in Utah landed at RAF Lakenheath on Saturday for what the Pentagon characterized as several weeks of training with NATO allies.
Russia's defense ministry has released pictures and related materials of a military base in the Arctic, displaying the location with 3D panoramic technology. The base is a permanent structure located on the 80th parallel and has an area of 14,000 square meters. The building was erected on the large island of Alexandra Land, part of the Franz Joseph Land archipelago. It includes a command control center, facilities for military and special equipment, and facilities for the Army's daily life activities. According to the ministry, the base can house 150 soldiers and stock enough food and fuel for as long as 18 months. Russia is building up its Arctic military infrastructure as part of its naval doctrine, which proclaims the region as a top priority due to its mineral deposits and strategic importance.
Norway is training women to be kick-ass soldiers. The unique all-women military training program is really intense, but since the Special Forces program's launch in 2014, women have been signing up by the hundreds for the Hunter Troop. Women in Hunter Troop have year-long training that includes counterterrorism and Arctic survival. In order to complete the program, there's also a daunting list of physical tasks, like racing with full gear through 9 miles of forest. That part has to be completed in 2 hours and 15 minutes. One advantage of having women in combat, some militaries use women soldiers to talk with and gather information from women civilians in Middle Eastern countries like Afghanistan. Hunter Troop units have yet to deploy, but could be setting a new standard for women in militaries.
The Armed Forces of the Philippines plans to create Muslim fighting units. Military spokesperson Colonel Edgar Arevalo said in a statement April 15th that up to 5% of new recruit slots will be set aside for Muslims. Arevalo said the long-term goal is to create a dedicated division to be deployed in the southern Philippines, where state troops are fighting Muslim extremists. He said the plan aims to help the military operate in Muslim areas where Filipinos view all Christian units with suspicion of invasion. He said Muslim soldiers would also be more aware of religious and cultural, quote, sensitivities. The southern Philippines is the traditional homeland of the country's Muslim minority. The region has been troubled by armed conflict for nearly half a century. Major rebel groups there have been in talks with the government to broker a peace deal, but some oppose the negotiations, and others have declared allegiance to ISIS.
Experts and officials said U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis will focus on the fight against the Islamic State on his first trip to parts of the Middle East and Africa. He will also supposedly articulate President Donald Trump's policy towards Syria. His trip could give clarity to adversaries and allies about the U.S. administration's tactics in the fight against Islamic State militants, along with its willingness to use military power more liberally than former President Barack Obama did. U.S.-backed forces are currently fighting to retake the Islamic State strongholds of Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria.
Members of the UK Parliament want the Home Secretary to revoke the Syrian First Lady's UK citizenship. Liberal and Conservative MPs have been quoted by various UK news outlets as saying Asma al-Assad needs to make a choice, stop defending her husband's regime or lose her citizenship. Assad, who was born in England, has been married to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad since 2000. That's also the year he assumed leadership of Syria following his father's death. Though he has denied it, U.S. officials say Assad's regime has launched chemical attacks on civilians. Asma al-Assad has made more public appearances in recent months. In a rare TV interview in October, she told a Russian TV outlet that she declined offers of asylum for her and her children. She called the offers, quote, a deliberate attempt to shatter people's confidence in their president. Photos and video of her have appeared more frequently on the Syrian presidency's social media accounts, as well as ones bearing her name. An April 7th post on her purported Facebook account shared a statement from the Syrian presidency. The statement condemned U.S. strikes on a Syrian airfield, calling the actions, quote, a naive pursuit of a frenzied false propaganda campaign. Asma al-Assad grew up and attended college in London. She worked in banking in New York and Paris before marrying President Assad. The couple met during the early 90s while Bashar was studying to be an ophthalmologist in London. He wasn't expected to inherit the Syrian presidency, but his older brother's death in 1994 changed that. Early in his presidency, Bashar and Asma al-Assad visited the UK and made stops at the hospital where he trained and her childhood neighborhood in West London.
Russian law enforcement officials say they're questioning a new suspect in the hunt for the terrorists who attacked the St. Petersburg metro on April the 3rd.
Фамилия?
Азимов.
Имя?
Абрар.
Отчество?
Охранович.
За что задержаны? Догадываетесь?
Да. Больно. Боевой.
More than 100 Kashmiri students have been injured in clashes with Indian security forces. On Monday, April 17th, hundreds of students in Srinagar protested a raid by Indian police over the weekend. The Kashmir University Students' Union called for protests against Indian rule after the Saturday raid left more than 50 students injured at a college in southern Kashmir. Indian police were reportedly looking for suspects in recent violent demonstrations. According to the Agence France-Presse, government forces aren't allowed to be on college and university campuses without permission. Protesters threw stones during the Monday demonstrations, while police fired shotgun pellets and tear gas. India and Pakistan each rule parts of Kashmir, but both claim all of the region. It has been disputed since British rule ended there in 1947. Tensions have run especially high in the region since April 9th, when 8 were killed in clashes with Indian forces on Election Day.
With less than a week before the first round of the French presidential election, candidates are making a final push to win undecided voters. The centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron held a rally in Paris on Monday. In the latest poll, the former investment banker and economy minister leads the race with far-right candidate Marine Le Pen, and both of them on 22%.
Well, speaking of Paris, hundreds of people gathered in the French capital over the weekend to rally against the National Front Party and their presidential candidate Marine Le Pen ahead of next Sunday's election. Mass protesters hurled rocks and smoke grenades at police who responded with tear gas.
The anti-Le Pen protesters have come here to protest against the fact that the National Front is due to hold a rally in the venue just behind me. We saw hundreds of people lining up to go into that venue earlier today. This is clashes between the protesters and the police. The protesters lighting fires, throwing glass bottles. I mean, there's actually glass all on the floor behind me from where they've been throwing those bottles. And they have been also throwing canisters at the police, rocks even. And we did see one camera person, one member of the press, having their camera taken off them and smashed to pieces in front of us as those protesters were making their protests. They were saying that they're unhappy with the National Front holding this rally here in Paris. They call them fascists, and they say that they don't want them here, and they're calling on people to rise up on the streets in Paris against them.
Thousands have taken to the streets of Istanbul and several other cities to protest against the outcome of the referendum in Turkey. Some chanting "Thief Erdogan" and others "No to the presidency." They showed their anger at the yes victory to change the constitution and grant sweeping powers to the president. Turkey's main opposition parties rejected the result and called for the vote to be annulled. I believe there are a lot of irregular and illegal incidents. We heard a lot of news. We stood up for our vote that day. We don't accept the yes result because the outcome was no. I don't want the parliament to be interrupted. I want a parliament 100% elected by us. I'm against one-man rule and dictators. The narrowness of the victory has raised doubts. Election observers say the referendum was an uneven contest, with arrests of journalists and the Yes campaign dominating coverage. International monitors pointed out that a last-minute decision by the Electoral Board to accept unstamped ballots contradicted electoral law.
President Erdogan dismissed all criticism and continued to attack the West at a rally in Ankara. We won't see or hear the politically motivated reports you prepare. We continue on our paths. Tell that to my hat. This country has seen the most democratic election not ever seen in any Western country. Despite nearly half of the electorate voting against the referendum, President Erdogan doesn't seem to be taking any steps towards reconciliation. Instead, the Turkish cabinet extended the state of emergency, under which, since July, thousands of political opponents have been arrested and dismissed from their jobs.
Reports of violent crime on the rise in some cities in California, Los Angeles and San Francisco in particular, as some are blaming early release laws from prison meant to cut the prison population.
Well, Bill, more than a dozen states are considering similar plans to save money. Problem is, and California's warning to others is, prison reform doesn't work unless you actually reform those getting out.
Enough is enough. You're passing these propositions, you're creating these laws that is raising crime.
Like a dozen other states, California is trying prison reform.
This is Governor Jerry Brown. Vote for Proposition 57. It saves money and reduces crime.
Last year, Governor Brown sold voters on Prop 57, which mandated the early release of supposed nonviolent offenders. Critics have heard it before.
The most recent statistics from the U.S. Department of Justice show that violent crime rates in some California cities has increased by over 50%.
Prosecutors say measures to reduce the prison population by releasing nonviolent offenders early and making some felonies misdemeanors has backfired.
It's not good for our communities and it's not good for our officers.
Chief Jeff Piper blames prison reform for the death of Officer Keith Boyer. Under the old law, his killer would have been behind bars for violating the terms of his release 4 times.
They should have called them releasing violent felons into your community early and without supervision, but no one would have voted for them based on that.
Advocates say reform works when states invest in alternatives.
New York and New Jersey have reduced their prison populations 25% in the last decade, and they've seen crime rates decline.
So the criticism here is, number one, the state considers inmates nonviolent if their current offense is nonviolent. It ignores violent felony priors, Bill. And number two, inmates who violate their probation or parole are not going back to prison, but only jail. Police say that's no deterrent. So some lawmakers want to reform the reforms. So actually we get safer streets.
Wow, a changing situation for certain. Thank you.
A melting glacier has caused an entire river to vanish, something that hasn't happened for thousands of years. The massive glacier in northern Canada has lost about a mile of ice from its edges over the past century, according to a new study. The glacier had sent meltwater to the Slims River, but it shrank so much that the meltwater changed course and joined the Kaskawulsh River instead. The scientists say the event has completely changed the local landscape. The newly exposed riverbed is attracting sheep from a nearby national park to an area where they can be legally hunted. Other changes, like shifts in sediment transport, lake chemistry, and fish populations, are expected as the ecosystem adapts. This capture of river flow by another is known as river piracy. It can happen due to tectonic movements, landslides, erosions, or changes in glacial dams, like the one in Canada. Geologists have documented past occurrences of river piracy dating back thousands of years. The sinking Rhine and Danube river basins experience river piracy too, But this new research shows the first evidence of river piracy.
Winter seemed reluctant to leave parts of Germany, which received heavy snowfall on Easter Monday. In Siegen, fire crews were out cutting down branches from trees covered in a thick blanket of snow. For some, it meant traffic chaos, with Autobahn 45 backed up for 10 kilometers between Hagen and Olpe as rescue services attempted to clear up minor accidents.
Researchers just got their first chance to study a bizarre worm that lives in mangrove swamps. It's a species of shipworm that grows up to 5 feet long. A giant shipworm is a bivalve, like a clam or an oyster, and it has its own shell. The shell was usually the only part of the animal ever recovered because the researchers didn't know where it lived. Until now, it burrows into the mud in shallow lagoons full of rotting wood. For most shipworms, rotting wood is lunch, but the giant shipworm doesn't even have to eat. It doesn't have to eat anything. Instead, it gets energy from symbiotic bacteria that live in its gills. The bacteria use hydrogen sulfide from the rich mud in the swamps as fuel, and they release organic carbon as waste. It's more than enough to keep the shipworm alive. It works so well that its own digestive tract has atrophied from disuse. We don't see animals switch away from actual food all that often. It seems to happen most in extreme environments, and with hosts that don't have to move much. The tube worms that live near hydrothermal vents rely on bacteria for their food, too.
Just look at the horrific shape this poor dog was in when rescuers found her at a church. Barely alive, the dog named Franny was stabbed more than a dozen times all over her body. She was suffering from blood loss, shock, and trauma. An animal cruelty task force in Missouri took the poor pup in to care for her and clean her wounds. Nearly a month later, the 10-year-old poodle mix has made a remarkable recovery. She's now been adopted by the family of the first responder who rescued her. A new home coming from the heart of a hero.